Okay, it's 6:15. I see that we're recording now, and I always like to start on time. We had posted this at 6:15, and I recognize that people are busy, and it's always nice to start on time. Some people have, maybe tight schedules. My name is Dave Borkert. I'm a commander with the Nome Police Department. I appreciate the turnout tonight. It's nice to have this type of turnout. We're really looking at the primary reason for this meeting is to gather input. So as far as anything formal or binding, it won't be. We're looking for that input, and we are seriously considering that input for several reasons. One thing that we'll be looking at is even camera selection. So if we have strong, compelling input that they want it to have a certain feature, that's going to be considered as far as camera selection in the future. And then also as far as policy development. So everything that we're gathering right now, as far as information, we're going to be sharing, and we're recording it when it's coming in, and then we're also we've had input that's already been offered through an online survey, and then we've been advertising that, and we've had people contacting me and also the police chief with information, and we're collecting all of it, and then we'll be sharing it with. Ultimately, just to explain what the process is, whenever we're doing policy development or we're even looking at something as serious as selection for something like this, what we'll be doing is we'll be sharing that information with the city attorney. The city attorney will give us legal advice, make sure that they don't see any legal conflicts with that. And then ultimately at the end, the city council will decide what's purchased or if we purchase something. And then realistically the type of camera that we're going to be selecting and the type of equipment that goes along with that. So we have a fairly large Department of Justice grant, a DOJ grant. It's a $30,000 grant, and it's a matching grant. We've been approved for that. So there's, as far as funding, that's a positive way as far as hopefully finding the camera that best fits our needs, again, if we choose to buy one, and also like the type of equipment that would go along with that. And, we're taking, as far as the police department, we're taking this very serious, and, we're really looking for public buy-in, public input, and we've selected a committee. The committees, as far as the police department committee, they've been working for actually quite a couple of months already. And we have subject matter experts. First of all, we're looking for people that want to serve on that committee, and then also individuals that maybe have some certain subject matter expertise in different areas. I'm just going to throw them on the spot now, and I'm going to have each one of them introduce themselves. If we could just informally go from this side that way, but if you could please stand up.
Charles or Chip Rashi, corporal with the police department, been here about 15 years.
Officer Tara Martin, been with you long for about 4 years. Just a patrol officer right now.
Andrew Rockman, again, patrol officer. I've been with the city for almost 4 years now.
And Corporal Keith Anderson, I've been with the department for about 15 years.
Thank you. The one committee member that's missing is Corporal Jeremy Reed. Sergeant Jeremy Reed. He wasn't able to make it, and he's been an important part of this committee. He's actually worked on as far as even application of the grant, so he's very well tuned as far as the needs of that grant and compliance with that grant, and then also we're looking at the community needs as well. So he's been a vital part, but he wasn't able to make it tonight. So I'm just going to start off by covering, maybe just broadly talking about the subject and some areas of concern that we have, things that we need to look at. Now, as far as collecting data, whenever the government and the Nome Police Department, we're local government, whenever a government collects data, there's a presumption that that's public. So meaning that that's public, if anybody comes in and asks for that information, there's a presumption that it's public, so we have to be able to have either a law, federal, state law that says that it's private, or even as far as policy development, that has to address that if we want to go into a certain area and deem that private. And there's 3 levels of public, or there's 3 levels of information, government data. It's confidential, public, and private. Confidential, essentially, if you're trying to get confidential information, so there's a difference between confidential and private. Confidential, even if it's on you or you're, what you would maybe think as the owner of it, it involved you. If it's deemed confidential, even you can't get it. The only way you can get confidential information is with a court order. So you have to have something signed by a judge. The private information, that generally, if it's deemed private, you can get it yourself. So if it had a recording of you with, let's just say there was a situation involved, it's deemed private, where inside your living room or your bedroom, for whatever reason, it would meet that standard where it's private. You yourself would be able to get that information. We wouldn't be able to give that out to everyone else, again, unless we would have a court order. We always comply with court orders. And then the other one is public. And public means that absolutely anyone can have it. We're not even supposed to ask why you want it, because it comes with Freedom of Information Act, Minnesota Public Data Act, which is very closely parallels that. And we're not even supposed to ask why you would want that information. It's really none of our business. It's either public or it's not. If it's public information, we would provide that. So that's why it's important, like when we're talking about these things, like when we're recording, that's significant. So if we record it, then, potentially, again, just like I'd mentioned, there's a presumption that that's public. So if we're going into, and one dilemma that we would have, and that's where we want to get information from the public, input from the public. If we go into someone's residence, they may not want that to be public information. However, if we turn off that camera, if we're just taking it upon ourselves to do that, and later on, let's say there's some type of physical contact because things go south, and that happens a lot in law enforcement. We get called to a residence, everything appears fine. If we're turning off that camera later on, if something would happen, we could be answering the question, okay, you have cameras available to you. It's a valuable resource. You've paid for that with government dollars, taxpayer dollars. Whether there's a matching grant or not from the feds, it's still government dollars. And now that resource isn't available. Why? Well, we have to be able to explain that there's a policy involved, that we turned off the cameras, or that there's a state law that protects that. So that's why this is very important, that we're able to get the information from the public, because that's going to have a significant factor, again, with camera development or vendor, like what type of camera we're going to purchase, and then also server capacity, and what type of server we're going to have, if we're going to go on the cloud, or if we're going to have a server at the PD. And then also as far as policy development. So everything that you share tonight, has impact, and it's certainly going to be shared with the individuals making the decisions. So at this time, I think just to keep things rolling, we're going to open things up for questions later, but I'm going to turn it over to Officer Martin. She has a PowerPoint she's going to go through and just kind of share some information that we've already gathered.
Okay, so we had the online survey, as you had mentioned. So this is just going to be questions 1 through 7 of the input we received that we can actually see on a graph. If anyone wants to fill out a survey on paper who wasn't able to do it online, I have that here for you, and we've got pens as well. So just come up and get that before we're done here tonight. So question 1, do you generally believe body-worn cameras would help increase community trust in law enforcement? We can see by the graph, most people do believe that would increase community trust. Question 2, do you believe offender suspect behavior would be improved if the officer is wearing a body-worn camera during contact? As you can see, the majority was yes. Third question, do you feel officers should inform citizens they are being recorded? A few more people answered no than yes. It's pretty close though. Question 4, are you open to officers' body-worn cameras recording in your home? Most people responded yes. And we kind of had to leave this generic because we can't put every possible scenario that might happen in a home, so that's why it's just so basic for this one. Question 5, when do you feel an officer should activate a body-worn camera? The majority responded with during all contacts. Question 6, in your opinion, do you believe most members of the community are in favor of officers using body-worn videos? Most were in favor. Question 7, I would feel comfortable and confident in my interactions with the New Ulm police officers wearing a body-worn camera during my contact with them. Almost everyone answered yes, or true. And this is just an age range of everyone who took it. So the average age was ages 30 to 39. Do you want to go over this?
What's that?
The requirements that we have? Or do you?
I can do it.
Okay. Does anyone want me to pass around the surveys?
Well, while she's passing that out again, I'm Officer Ackman. With the Department of Justice grant that we got, to get that grant, the federal requirements require certain things that have to be met in our policy and certain things to get that grant. These are some of the mandatory requirements that they require. So these are some of the things we have to consider when making a policy and doing a selection in this thing for this body-worn camera. Gonna hit some of the major ones here. Again, did agency involve appropriate internal units in police and policy development? That's kind of why we have us here, is to help add that internal input from the officers in this policy. And that's why we're here also to now get your input as citizens. Give you guys a chance to read those. And again, if anyone has any questions on these, so I'll let you read them, and if anyone has any questions on these. And when it comes to this, the policy that we're making, if we get these body-worn cameras, this is a document that's not static. It doesn't just stay where it's at. It's going to be continuously evolving. If we go ahead and purchase body-worn cameras and go ahead and we find that there is needs for the policy to change, we'll have to consider that. And some, again, as Commander Burkett said, like, does the policy specify when officers are to activate the body-worn cameras? How we document the existence of the recordings. Does it provide guidance on citizen notification for the cameras? And when to deactivate. It's always going to be one of the major issues, is activation and deactivation of the cameras. As he said, and you can see in the surveys, it's one of our concerns is when we go into residences or other times that people are, say, in a vulnerable situation. Again, we'll get into the policy, like, does it specify where the video is stored and how long? Again, some of this is covered by multiple state and federal statutes on some of these issues. And the last couple here. Again, if anyone has any questions on these, again, we can kind of go back and touch on them. But this is just to give you an overview of some of the things that we have to address as a police department and as a city when doing this policy. So we do have some guidelines that we have to follow as well.
And this is just a screenshot of the city's webpage. This is where we're going to continue to update everything. As you can see here, it's a link to our current draft. There will be many drafts of these that are static. Otherwise, there's a link that we would click if we want to see updated. But we do plan on putting an email link on here, so you can email us with questions should those arise. Otherwise, you can email us if you know who we are as officers. But we are going to keep this webpage updated as best we can.
And then also, as far as, contacting, some people are very comfortable emailing. Some people would just as soon contact one of us in person. So, by all means, please feel free to contact either Chief Myron Wheeland or myself at the police department line, 233-6750. And we'll be collecting that data. We have an ongoing collection that we share. If you want to remain anonymous, you can. If you give the name and it's like, I don't want my name shared, please share that as well. But realistically, we're just trying to get numbers. And like I said, we've been very pleased as far as ongoing people sharing some of their concerns with us, and they've had some very valid concerns. But again, we just want to make that real clear that ultimately, at the end of the day, and we'll certainly advertise that as well, the city council makes the final decision, and they're elected officials, and they're certainly the ones that have the legal requirement and responsibility and authority to do that. So again, but as far as timelines, we're I say sooner the better if we're going to do this, or if we're not going to do this, we make the decision, sooner than later. I don't like things when they drag out, and the chief agrees with me. So after this meeting, realistically, I think, we're certainly going to be gathering data and gathering input as we go along, but we really want to be moving towards a decision, either to do it or not to do it. And then, what type of equipment we're going to purchase. We don't have anything purchased. We've maybe been throwing around different options in our head, but we've made no commitment to purchase anything. We're really looking for the community input before we do that. And then also as far as policy development, we're looking at input. Again, if we're turning off the camera, that's a policy. If I have one of our officers turns off a camera, when they go, given that scenario, they go inside of a residence, they get called there's a call at a certain residence, they show up there, they go inside, they turn off the camera. If there's a policy that says that whatever the circumstances are, they turned off the camera, that's as far as I'm concerned, very reasonable. If they didn't follow policy, that's maybe not as reasonable. That's something that we'd want to be looking into. So that's the kind of information we're looking for. If realistically at this time, what I think would be the most logical is I'm just going to go through. I'd be looking for, if anybody has information they want to share, I'd be looking for that. I know sometimes people don't feel comfortable speaking in a crowd. We certainly respect that. And then, if you could contact me at a later time, or I'm going to certainly be here after the meeting, and we can have that discussion as well. But, just for the benefit of everyone, and just to get this kind of moving forward as far as discussion, I'm just going to go through these questions, and I'm looking for respectful discussion. And again, if no one has anything to share, we understand that as well. If you want to share that later, we understand that as well. But if when you're addressing me, I don't see that we're necessarily going to have any type of arguments, but it's not my first rodeo. I've seen that before. So what I always ask is if you could just address me. Okay, that kind of takes the emotional thing out of it. Sometimes if there's something that someone is debating, I don't necessarily anticipate that, but I think that's healthy discussion as well. So as far as, do you generally believe body-worn cameras would help increase community trust in law enforcement? Yes, no, unsure. Does anybody have any comment on that? Anyone? Because we had this purposely right after the Human Rights Commission meeting, because there's individuals that are entrusted to look out for civil rights and human rights. So, if any of them have anything to offer, yes, sir.
Well, you put a camera on a police officer.
Yes.
It's either the camera or the police officer, and some officers are different than others. So one officer might turn it off in a situation, another officer might not turn it off. So it's up to the discretion of the officer if he wants to put you on camera or whatever it is.
Not.
The point is, there's better officers and there's not so good officers.
But
that's my opinion.
And I certainly respect that opinion. That's what we're really looking for, though, here, is because if we have a policy that the camera doesn't go off, as far as I'm concerned, as far as the chief's concerned, that's our job to make sure that camera doesn't go off. If we have a policy that says the camera does go off under these circumstances, if you go up to a residence and they say, you know what, I want the camera off, and our policy reflects that, then, you know, certainly I would say they better respect that and turn the camera off. So it won't be completely up to the discretion. Of course, there can always be some type of malfunction with the equipment, but realistically, short of that, they should be following policy. Does that address that comment or that question that you have?
Yes, so.
If I can interject, Commander. Another thing is the policy does state if we shut it off, we have to give a reason prior to shutting it off. So if we're going to shut it off, say we're in your house, we're at a point where, you know, there's really no evidentiary reason for it to be on, or you're in a situation where we want to protect your privacy, we can shut the camera off, but we have to say into the camera, I'm shutting it down, this is why. And so it's on record that's the reason it was shut off.
Okay, when you go into a resident, you have to inform the people that you got a camera on.
Actually, state law does not require that.
What if a homeowner just says, well, I don't want a camera in here? I mean, if it's just something for, I call up because the dog's barking next door or some dumb thing like that.
Right. And at that point, you know,
You
the
know.
officer's gonna, like you say, I mean,
You know.
if an officer responds, they're gonna go, okay, I don't need the camera for this. So we might have to turn it on because our policy says we have to turn it on when we first get there, okay? But once we get into the situation and now I realize, if it's me, I realize, okay, I don't need the camera on. I do have the leeway to shut it off, but again, I have to state the reason why I shut it off into the camera prior to shutting it off,
So like, for example, just to elaborate on that, and that's, you know, what you're well spoken, but if they show up at a situation and you just had brought up that scenario, it's like, you know, I don't want to be recorded for this. Could you please turn the camera off? If our policy allows for us to turn that camera off, we would simply state, I'm turning off the camera because a resident asked me to, and then it's turned off at that time. Now, if something happens later on, there's a dog, something we end up tasing or using chemical on the dog or something like that because the dog attacks us. Later on, if that question comes up, well, why wasn't that captured on camera? Well, because we turned it off, we're following policy. Yes?
So in a situation where you have an escalated call and the person who's escalating, like a domestic dispute, says, oh, I don't want the camera on, is the policy going to say at that point, no, I have to keep the camera on? I mean, I'm thinking that, you know, a dog barking and domestic violence are like way at the other end of the spectrums.
Mhm.
So I would hope there'd be a policy that would state at some point that when someone says, I don't want the camera on, but there's, you know, true almost violence going on, that the camera would stay on. Is that something you're talking about, or is that actually something that's already in a policy that you're following or planning to follow?
We don't have the policy developed yet. Like I said, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that input. And, you know, certainly I think you bring up some very valid points, ma'am. We do want to address that because those are, like you know, again, well spoken, different sides of that spectrum. You know, dog barking complaint, noise complaint, something like that, versus a domestic in progress. Those are two very different things. And, you know, to some extent, I always like when we're doing policy development that the officers have some discretion as long as they're following policy. They're not outside that policy because, again, when you're there, you're going to be able to know if it's within compliance of policy or not. The one concern I always have, not a problem, but the concern I always have is if we're turning off the camera and we're coming up to someone's residence. I've been in law enforcement for 25 years, and I know things change relatively fast. Sometimes you think you're having a very civil, nice conversation, and things change and take a turn really fast. A lot of times in a situation like that, that's just human nature. You're not thinking camera. You're thinking, you know, I've got to protect my gun. I got to do this or whatever. I got to fend off this attack because someone's slugging me or something like that. Situation like that, you might not think of turning that camera on, and now you've missed some valuable data. And again, sincerely, when we later on, that's a valid question. Why didn't you have your camera on? Especially if someone gets hurt, whether that's the officer or the individual. Why wasn't that camera on? We purchased it with tax dollars. and it's a valuable resource, and it wasn't on. Well, but that's where we're really looking for that policy, because it is kind of, there's a spectrum there. Yes, in the back.
Is it possible that the camera would be on and recording, and then as necessary that part of the video redacted but still kept intact as the full video for the police servers, but what's released or possibly released to be able to be requested by the public be redacted in the parts that are led by policy?
To some extent. Did everybody hear that question? There, as far as redaction, we certainly will have that capability. But the one situation that comes up, we can have a policy on it, and certainly the policy is going to reflect. Our policy can never trump Minnesota state statute. We don't have that ability. So if the statute says, the Minnesota Public Data Act says that it's public information, our policy can't say that it's private. Okay, our policy might be able to reflect that we can turn the camera off prior to, but again, once we collect it, there's a responsibility. It's considered government data. But just to answer your question, yes, I mean we certainly would have the redaction capability, and if our policy allows for us to redact that under those circumstances, I would imagine we would. But again, that's going to be policy development. Once we capture it, it's captured. It's there. I don't know if that answered your question, but did it at least address it?
Yes, sir.
Actually, according to the current policy, there are specific times where we can do the redaction, and it's actually required at that point. And so, to answer your question, yes, there are going to be times where we can redact certain information because it's required before it releases to the public. So.
Can you give it for instance?
What's that?
Can you give an instance of where it's required to be redacted?
Well, to be honest with you, if you're in a video, say you're a witness in a video, and we have to release it because it was, hopefully it never happens, but it's an officer-involved shooting. You can request at that point, according to our current policy, the way it is written, that be redacted, that your face and voice be redacted, if I'm not mistaken, Andy.
Minors as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, that a lot of it covers, and that's part of the state statute that covers a lot of that. Minors, undercover officers, victims, if it releases any kind of, like it's a domestic and you might release a victim and stuff, some of that stuff. Again, the video then becomes private and we can't release it without doing some of that redaction or stuff like that.
So federal and state law, and they've been working through drafts just as far as, this is a work in progress. Again, this is a significant portion of our policy development process. However, just to be very clear, federal and state law always trump it. So if they say that a juvenile information that's going to be redacted, that gets redacted. It's just that simple. Undercover officers, redacted. Individuals, they talk about also individuals that are working as informants. That's redacted, and that's just covered by, that's just us kind of rehearsing because we're very familiar with the statute. But that's always redacted, and it's redacted because it's considered private. Yes.
Does the law specify how long the public information has to be retained? I'm thinking maybe some people's fears about turning the camera off or leaving it on could be alleviated if they know that if the information's not needed, it's deleted in so many days or so many weeks, and it's not pertinent then, whether it's on or not, because it's deleted.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Have you looked at, I'm looking at Corporal Anderson?
Officer Achman has that information.
Yeah, looking at the state statute and stuff, and we do this with our squad camera that we have now. And most of the software that comes with all these body-worn cameras and stuff, it has the capability. There's a retention schedule for how long we keep our data. So for most incidents, like right now, we have a 90-day minimum, or a 90. So if, say, I'm recording an incident, nothing happened, I went to a barking dog, there was no issues, problem was solved. 90 days after that video, it's going to get automatically deleted. So we will have a system in place that does that for sure, because that also becomes an issue for our storage. I mean, storing all these videos is a cost-intensive measure, and that's the reason we just don't keep them in permanently, but that's a good concern of yours, I can see that. But we follow that retention schedule, and I know we will post that. I think the plan is to post that retention schedule when we figure it out exactly. But I know the minimum, I believe, is 90 days.
And that's a very good point, because the longer we store it, that's a significant cost as far as the equipment, because storing the data, that that the longer we store something and the more we record, of course, that you need to have larger servers, and that gets costly fast. Now again, there's a benefit to society that we're retaining, but I always like to kind of give examples of extremes. I mean, storing something for 5 years would be that'd be unrealistic. That'd be very, I think, cost prohibitive if we were doing something like that. So, but we're probably, in general, we're probably looking at something similar to our squad cameras, 90 days, something like that. But again, it's still going to have to be approved, and we're looking for input. If people think, it should be longer than that, we'll certainly consider that, and we'll certainly share it with the individuals making those decisions. Yes.
Will there be a backup to the server?
I can answer. I'll get to your question here in a second. And just to answer it, if there is like a critical incident, let's just say an officer involved shooting or something like that, that is retained longer than the 90 days. That is built into the retention schedule. That stuff will either be retained for 5-7 years or permanently. For the backup, yes, New Ulm does have a backup. I'm not sure the exact time period that it backs up. So all the data that gets saved now eventually is backed up to another off-site server that's not in the city of New Ulm. So if something would, again, tornado, fire in the police station, our server would be destroyed. We would have a backup of the data. We might not have necessarily maybe that day's worth, or I don't know again exactly when the period comes, but there is a backup of that. I believe the backup site is in Hutchinson. So.
And then another question.
Sure.
The school resource officer, would he be required to wear a camera?
Again, it would depend on policy, but I would certainly think the school resource officer should be wearing a camera. He or she is a licensed officer, and again, it's a valuable resource. I'm confident they'd be wearing a camera, but again, I'm not the one setting policy. We're just looking for that input. A lot of the data that he or she'd be collecting would be probably defined as private, because you're dealing with juveniles. But that's part of redaction, the redaction process.
Officer Bremer, our school resource officer, has already been talking to the school in reference to their concerns or their suggestions as to when not, that kind of stuff. So.
You keep bringing up policy. Are you going to buy cameras before you have policy or after?
Once we decide what type of camera we have, like for example, one question I'm looking for is if there's some special unique features. Like for example, if I have a camera and I have it placed on my chest, that's very common. That's a common place to mount a camera, like right in the middle of your chest. If I had something like that on, if I have someone that comes from the side, like my peripheral vision, if I have someone that there's something that's going on the side, or even behind me, wherever I turn my head, that's not going to be captured on that camera because it's facing forward. Now, if I move my whole torso, it would capture that. But if I just turn my head, it won't. So, for example, to address that question, is we're looking for, if we're looking for strong input, that we want to be able to capture that peripheral, that if I'm turning my head, then that's going to be part of the type of camera that we select. So before we buy something, we're going to have to address that. Is that worthwhile? Does that serve the benefit of the community as far as that selection? As far as policy, we're looking for that information, but realistically, whether you go with, there's a large spectrum as far as the cameras that are available in the market, but realistically, they all do the same thing. They're recording. So as far as the policy development, I think we can keep working towards policy development and start working towards actually selecting something. As far as a timetable with the cameras, we're going to have the policy in place before we turn the cameras on when we're serving the community. But we're looking for, the very near future, starting selecting cameras, and we're going to have like a pilot project probably, you were thinking sometime probably in summer. Is that still
That's kind of what we.
that was a timetable that at least the chief had brought to my attention. So sometime in summer, we'll have like 1 or 2 officers wearing them. Now, we're going to have that policy in place so that they know when they can turn it on, turn it off, that they're following that policy. But then we're just looking at is that a good fit for us? Or is there going to be some snags in that product? Is there maybe a better camera available? Because sometimes, if just like anything, you test drive a car, you find out you didn't really care for that car. There's some problems with that. So that pilot project's going to give us an opportunity to look at if that's really serves our needs, if it's a good product. And then realistically, I'm thinking sometime around early fall is when we're going to have full implementation. Because I believe, again, it's important that we move forward. Either we decide we're not going to do it, or if we do it, I think it's important that we strive to do it in a timely manner.
Would every officer have cameras when they're out in the field, or would it be just 2 or 3?
We're looking for that information as well. I'm going to say I think everybody should have a camera on if they're working, if they're taking calls for service, that they should, calls for service meaning they're patrolling, they're responding to the radio, and going to the citizens' houses, doing traffic stops. I think that they should have, if they're working, they should have a camera on. Everyone working, yes.
That was going to be my question too, because it's not just the shift that's working. So in other words, you won't have 4 or 6 cameras, you'll have to have more, because there could be an incident, God forbid, but there could be an incident where everybody gets called in.
Mm-hmm.
And there is where you probably are, that's the real time when you're probably really going to need the cameras, because there's a lot of things going on, at least according to what the television shows.
I think that's a very good point. The question in the back?
I have it's kind of a 2-parter.
Okay.
Will the videos, officer recorded videos, be used for annual performance reviews that are taken just general, we pick random and let's review these as the officer and whoever does the review to catch possible anything you could work on? I worked in a call center and they would record calls and they'd pull just random calls, and that's part of how your performance review proceeded.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part to the question, will the Human Rights Commission be able to view videos, possible, we'll just say, traffic stops, to see if there's anything that we're noticing that might be borderline on a human rights issue that we can, bring to the attention before there's an issue, a wider issue, I guess?
Sure. So I'll address the first one first. The auditing, as far as, and I'm looking at, we had this conversation right before we came down here. So I imagine you're talking about the auditing function. We have, as far as the Department of Justice grant, even just to be in compliance, we have to have self-auditing involved. And would one of you, either Corporal Anderson or Achman, would you be able to expand on that a little bit, what you've seen from other jurisdictions, or at least what you've discussed?
Well, I know, and then just my part is, I was listening to the news the other day, and the city council in Minneapolis has set a self-auditing beyond what the state requires. Unfortunately, and we're not Minneapolis, obviously, but with the number of officers they've got and the hours, I mean, they're talking 800,000 to 900,000 hours of video every year. And the police department there has said, we'll do the best we can, but we're going to tell you right now, it's completely impossible to be able to go through every last minute of video. And again, we're a different situation here. We're not going to have that much, but we're still going to have a lot of video. And as far as the auditing part of it, I know Officer Achman's a little more learned on that than I am, but
yeah, there is like a built-in biannual, like, to check the system to make sure everything's being recorded right, that the policies are being followed. We do have in our draft policy, at least right now, that some of the videos can be used like for when we have a new officer being trained in, for supervisors to take a look at that, and then like per the chief might be able to select a video for training purposes and stuff like that. That's built into the policy right now, but that would be left up to the chief or possibly the commander. We do have that built into the draft policy, at least right now, of reviewing the videos for that. So if there would be maybe, say, a complaint against an officer, it would be up to the chief or commander there to take a look at the video and review it.
And just to expand a little bit on the auditing, if you know my boss, the chief, he takes civil rights and community input very important. He makes that a priority. I know that we have a vacant position open as far as an administrative assistant position, and he purposely has left that vacant because he's looking for maybe an individual that maybe would have some of those knowledge, skills, and abilities in that area to be doing some of that auditing function for us. Now, that would be a civilian employee. They're not a licensed officer, but they still work for us. They still work for the Nolan Police Department, but where that individual would be helping with the auditing. You know, so like if you had with the Human Rights Commission, if you had some concern, if you wanted to do even some random auditing, you know, certainly that individual would be available to try to assist that as far as getting that information for you. As far as if it's available, you know, the question had been, you know, would it be available for the Human Rights Commission? You know, I'm going to say absolutely, and that's by state statute. Because again, if we collected it, it's public data. So if you make a public data request, that's just like if you're making a request for our reports. You simply come up, you make a request. It's like, you know, I want the report. You're at my neighbor's place on such and such a date and such a time. Or if you can give them more information. I mean, realistically, all we can ask is information to try to better find that report for you. We're not supposed to ask you why you want that information because it's none of our business. You're making a public data request, and it's our job to comply with that. This would be very similar to that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Both parts?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
So, two-part question as well. Do you know just the process of how we is thinking as far as how to go about requesting something? Would it be a form? Or would that person have to show ID for the form, that sort of thing? And then the follow-up to that is, if a request is denied, is there, I mean, I assume that there would be a reason for the denial. Is that something that would be done in writing, and then is there any kind of appeal to that? If someone has a request that's denied, can we take it somewhere else and essentially appeal?
I'll try to answer that in that order. As far as, you know, asking for identification right now I'm just treating this like it's a report, like a general police report. We're not supposed to ask people their identity. Because again, unless it's just a matter of us being able to share it, because you know, we'll say, like, if we have a report, we'll say, okay, how am I able to provide this for you? Would you like to pick it up at the office window? Well, of course, if you're walking up, or if you have someone walk up, we're going to at least know what you look like. Or can we put something on? Because, you know, we always have that front desk. Like if you come to the Nolan Police Department, right behind those windows, we have that counter. You know, is there some way you'd like me to put it out there as far as some type of identification? If you say, well, I'd like it be, you know, number 72 printed on there, then that's whenever you come up there, we'll give it to as number 72. Or if you say, yeah, just put my name down, Dave Borkert, you know, I'll come up later after work and pick it up. Then we'll have that. So then you've provided that, but that's just a means for us to be able to share that information with you. Sometimes we need to have an email address, or a lot of times people say, you know, could you just mail it to me? And we can. Then, of course, we're going to have a mailing address. So, but as far as requiring an ID, my understanding is no. We wouldn't be asking you for your identification or any type of form of ID to provide that. There might be a situation if we're providing something that could be considered private, because we just have to note that, in fact, it's your information. It involves either your child, which, again, you can access that information because it's private, because you're kind of the owner. You're the custodial parent, okay? Or otherwise, it's on you. It's private in nature, but it's, you know, it's private because it's private data on me. Now, I can request that under many of the circumstances. But then we would have to be able to note that what we provided you We didn't just, put it on a bulletin board or send it on Facebook or something like that, that we in fact gave it to you. Because again, we don't have any control once you have it, what you do with it, and that's your business. But we want to just make sure that if we ever get checked by the state, and we get, general audits, that we're complying with the law. Does that answer that question? Was there another question?
Just as far as if it's denied, is there any kind of appeal process where we can challenge the denial of somebody else or somebody else?
Well, if you make the request like from I'm considered the custodian of records for the Nome Police Department. So the chief has designated me as the custodian of records. I'm generally the appeal process. I mean, I'm the one that says, yes, that can be provided or not. So the administrative assistant is actually the one that gathers the data, and I approve it. So if there's something that's shared that shouldn't be shared or whatever the case is, that's on me. That's my job, and that's my responsibility. I get paid good money to do that. The appeal process is always the chief. The chief can always trump what Dave Borkert says. So in that case, that would certainly be the appeal process. The other option would be going to the city attorney. So if you're like, I know that information should be shared with me. I believe even though their heart's in the right spot, they're not providing it to me, and I think I'm entitled to it. You can always go through the city attorney. And if the city attorney says release it, we'll release it. Does that answer that?
Yep.
Will the videos have audio?
Yes, they will. Unless there's some type of mechanical difficulty, but yes, they will. Yes.
So I had another follow-up question. When you were answering my first question, it popped up. So if, let's say I am the subject of not an incident, but let's just say a call for service, right?
Mm-hmm.
So officers are at my house for whatever reason. There's no formal investigation or no formal charges, so it's public for the most part. If somebody else asks for that video, am I notified?
According to our current policy, you have the right to ask that your face and voice not be used in that video. And at that point, we would have to redact that information from the video.
And when we say that the policy, we're talking about the draft policy
the draft
that we're
policy.
working on. There's been no policy approved. It's just it's a working document.
Right.
And then kind of following what best practices have been from other jurisdictions. But again, it really relies on input, and then ultimately the city attorney saying that it's meets the legal standard, and then also approval by the council. It's not policy until the council says.
And I can just read what, like I say, this draft policy says about that. It says data on other individuals in the recording who do not consent to the release must be redacted.
Okay. So if under that and how it's worded, if I'm not consenting to the release, does that mean I am contacted prior to get my consent prior to it being released to a third party?
First, if I remember correctly, the person doing the requesting is the one that's going to have to get the approval to get that okay from that
Yeah, I'm
subject.
not 100% sure on that, to be honest.
I would say we'd have to. Like if maybe I'm thinking of a different scenario, but I'm thinking like I'm just envisioning that our officers respond to your house or your business, and if someone else, like a neighbor, requests that data, but maybe there's nothing criminal that happened or whatever, and you just don't want to share that information. You don't want your face and you don't want your voice in there. Am I following you correctly?
Essentially, yes.
So I would say that our policy is probably going to have to reflect that we have to have your permission to be able to share that. But again, that's going to be a policy development question. Did that answer it?
Yep.
Yes.
So I have a question. With the body cameras, when you come to our house and let's say it's medical or for a welfare check, are they going to stay on, or can we ask to have them turned off? Because of HIPAA laws?
And that's what we're looking as far as some of that input. So if we turn the cameras off, we're not collecting it. So then later on, there's no issues because we just simply didn't collect that information. There's no data available. If we're requested to turn it off, that's going to have to reflect in our policy. If we turn it off, that it's because the individual said, please turn it off, and then like Corporal Anderson said, we're saying in that mic, I'm turning it off because the patient or the citizen wanted the camera turned off, so that we're documenting it. Maybe even with the time or something like that. I don't know. But I mean, I think that would vary, but we'd have to be able to clearly document as far as transparency that the reason that we're turning it off. You know, I believe from what the draft is right now, I would imagine that everything would be redacted. As far as unless you give permission, your face would probably be redacted from that as far as anything that would identify you. And when we're doing that, like if we're looking at juveniles, it's I'm going to give that as an example. If you've ever asked for public information on a certain report and all you see is just basically it looks like black Sharpie. We do it now with a computer, but it's everything. It's almost just looks like it's nothing but black on there. You can't. There's like 5 words and then there's a whole bunch of redaction. That's because with juveniles, anything that reasonably would identify the juvenile, we have to redact, unless it's like it's on my own child. Then, if there's 10 juveniles involved with it, if I'm making the public data request, it's with my child, then everything with my child can be identified on there. Because again, it's private data on me or on my child, but every other child, every other juvenile would be redacted. So, I mean, I think in a case like that, we're going to have probably a lot of redaction. Did that answer?
I've got to follow up on something the officer over here said. You said you speak into the camera when you're going to shut it off.
Yes.
The reason why you're shutting it off.
Yes.
Do you have to speak into the camera when it's shut off to turn it on?
No.
You'd have to turn it on to speak in it, say,
Yes.
I'm turning it on because of?
No. The current draft policy, okay, and again, as the commander said, this isn't a finalized policy, it's just a draft that we're looking at now. That states right now that we would turn it on anytime we go to a call, okay? And as the commander said, I mean, we don't know what kind of camera we're gonna buy yet, but we do have, the company that we have our squad car video from also makes body worn cameras. And those can be set up to interact with the squad video, and then what it is we can turn the lights on the squad and that camera will automatically turn on.
Well, I guess I misunderstood you because you said you had to make a voice saying you're shutting it off.
Yes, if we're shutting it
You don't
off.
have to say anything to turn it on.
No,
Okay,
no.
gotcha.
Most of them are activated by like a some of them will be tied in depending on the camera we get, but a lot of them tie into like the squad, where if our lights or sirens are activated, it automatically activates the body camera. Otherwise, most of them say I was here with a body worn camera and something happened where I feel I needed to have it on right now. Most of them have a button of some kind where I can activate it if I want to. So just again, if I'm out at downtown Subway having my lunch and all of a sudden something occurs that I need to have it on, most of them have some kind of button on there.
But you don't have to have voice recording saying why you're turning it on.
No.
And then as far as, we haven't selected any camera yet. We're maybe, a lot of us are maybe interested in a certain camera simply because that's what our squad cameras have. And there's an advantage if, we don't have to relearn another system. And usually they kind of work together better if you go with the same vendor. However, having that said, if something would lack the capability, we're not going to go with it. But if there's, having all that said, logically we probably would go with something that's very similar, because there's simply a cost savings even with that, even as far as recording that, putting it on the server, things like that. Thing else, as far as I talked earlier about being able to pick up as far as having a camera. I don't know if you've ever seen the ones that are on people's, almost like their eyeglasses. So if they turn, it's captured. And I'm just looking for discussion, just in general. with all of that, that's one more moving part that we have. Does anybody have any feelings on that you'd like to share? I mean, you know, obviously wherever I turn my head, there's a benefit if I can capture it. At the same time, sometimes it's like, you know, how practical is it? How necessary is that? You know, one camera that I really like is the one that basically, if you look at Officer Achman, he has, well, both of them have mics on their radio. One would actually, well, there's several vendors that we'd be able to provide where we'd actually have it's hooked into the radio. So basically, if you have your radio on, you can transmit, and it's also your body camera. There's a benefit to that. Now, you can move that around. They can move their camera around. But again, if you have something that's happening on the side, the last thing you're thinking of is grabbing your camera and documenting that. So again, there's pros and cons, and I'm just looking for general discussion. Did you have your hand
I
up?
would think the one that had the widest peripheral vision would be the one to pick, instead of one that was straight and with some whip.
Mm-hmm.
Do
Personal
officers
opinion.
wear hats on? in
Generally,
their
no. I mean, sometimes like in winter, a stocking hat, but
Yeah, my question with I agree that the more vision you can get from the camera would be great, but how secure is something worn on the head if you're in pursuit, if you get jostled and have to get up again, you know, is the camera gonna fly off, whereas it's more secure on your actual body? Questions to think about?
no, that's a very good point, because there's always pros and cons, and there's unintended consequences to anything that you pick. But if you have the cameras that, if you ever look at the ones that the sheriff's office has, they basically they clip right onto their vest. Now that's relatively secure. The thing with your glasses, you know, you can get, if you're into an altercation, physical altercation, you know, or you're rolling around or something like that, certainly that could fall off. You know, something that's, as far as that radio mic, I'm looking at that I think that's the most practical. But again, it's not going to be up to me. It's just that would be my input as a citizen.
Well, you could almost train yourself, though, to try to turn instead of, if you hear something, to try to train your whole body to turn to accommodate the camera. I mean, that would be something that wouldn't be that hard to train yourself to do, so.
Right. It just that if you ever have a situation that, you know, when things rapidly change, you know, but yeah, you know, short of that, you're aware the camera's on. The longer you have it on, the more you're aware of it.
It would be picking up audio, even though it was not seeing the visual.
That's correct. Yep, that's correct.
Another comment that the comment that I'm gonna make is when I see the officers fully dressed on duty, I don't know how much all of your equipment weighs.
It's a lot.
It kind of looks like it's more than I'd want to carry around. So again, the weight of the camera, maybe that isn't a problem at all, but also that is another thing. If it fits in with your mic, probably wouldn't add that much to your load. I don't know, but I just think that's something else that, because even if you're running, you know, on a chase.
And that's a very good point. Anything else as far as discussion on that? Otherwise, like I said, you know, we're always looking for comments. You can certainly always share. If something comes up later, you can certainly share that point as well. Anything else? Any other comment? Yes.
Are any of you aware of any research that documents if wearing a camera and the perpetrator is aware of it, does it act as a deterrent, or might there be times when it actually could escalate a situation?
As far as, you know, scientific surveys or data on that, from what I've read, it doesn't really factor into it. But, you know, again, I'm not, you know, I don't know the sample size that was involved with it. That's just like from professional reading that I've done.
I don't know which magazine it was that came today. It might have been Twin Cities Today. There was an officer that made the statement that he sees no difference, especially if the person they're stopping or the person they're talking to is influenced or under the influence, however you want to say it, it's no difference if the camera is on. You tell them the camera is on, and certain people, big deal.
Mm-hmm.
They're still going to tell you what they think of you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times when we're dealing with individuals, they're agitated, and I don't believe it makes a difference. Again, according to the professional reading that I've done, it doesn't appear that it makes a difference. But there could be some type of survey that comes out in the future that they're like, yes, it does influence to some extent, but nothing that I'm aware of, ma'am. So I'm going to just throw out one more question. I mean, I know that with time there's some people that need to leave. As far as having the ability for us to access our own data, I'm just going to open that up for some discussion. So, like, for example, there's individuals that have concerns that if we're looking at our own collected data, like let's just say I have my camera on, something happens, I get in an altercation or someone jumps at me, and anyhow, there's a physical altercation and I use mace on them. And later on, anybody have input is there any concern with me actually accessing that to type my report? Because again, there's people out there and, they're valid concerns. They're saying that, you're only putting down what's being captured. Now, Dave Borkert, I look at it saying that I'm trying to look at, all the information and trying to provide the most information I possibly can for the judge, for the prosecutor in my police report. And I just think any resource I have, because I've had that many times with audio recordings, you're recording, it's like, yes, we did say that. But, at the time you're not thinking of it because things are moving fast. I'm just looking for, we're looking for citizen input, resident input. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think you should be able to access that because I think it really, everything starts, and given what I do, everything starts with the accuracy of the incident report. And having that as detailed as possible is important. However, I think if there's a mechanism to record who accessed it and if any edits were made, who edited, I think that would, I don't know if it's possible. I mean, I suppose it depends on the software and that's used, but because I guess what I wouldn't want to do is, officer go in there and be like, oh, I didn't like that, so let's splice that out of there, or whatever the case might be. So I think if something is recording, say, okay, 35 accessed this at 4:15, looks like it was reviewed, no edits made, that sort of thing. So if somebody wanted to come and say, I want to make sure that this is a true, depiction of what exactly happened, and then nothing was edited out. But I do think that they should be able to access.
I personally support that we're able to not edit, but that we're able to look at our own recording, just to make our reports accurate. But again, there's individuals that they're just saying that we're not going to document that unless it's recorded or something like that. So there's there are different views on it, and I respect those views. But I'm just looking for general input regarding that.
I think in the heat of the incident, to be able to go back and this is what I remember, this is what I wrote down, and then when you look at it, you say, oh, wait a minute, this is what really, you have to change your report or whatever it might be. But I do believe that our officers should have a chance to be able to go back and look at it. And I didn't say edit, but to go back and look to make sure that their report, because somebody, some defense attorney or whoever is going to ask for that eventually down the road if it's a serious enough situation.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, if you can make sure that your report is what happened.
Right, and that would be my general viewpoint. Ma'am, do you have something?
Just to add to that, it also, reviewing the video can also trigger things that you were thinking that aren't in your pad or aren't seen on the camera, but you're a logic that you were thinking through as you were taking an action.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm totally in favor of you being able to view the footage, because it's, everyone else is going to, why shouldn't you be able to?
Thank you. Anybody else regarding that? Anybody else have anything that's jumping out as far as a comment? Yes.
I vote you buy the cameras.
As far as, is there anybody that you know wants to offer anything as far as us not buying the cameras? Okay. Well, I'm going to be around after this. I'm always available if you want to contact myself or the chief. Chief Myron Whelan always has an open door policy. He looks forward to individuals contacting him and offering information. So if there's ever, you know, any type of viewpoint you want to share, by all means, feel free to contact the chief or myself. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think this was a really nice turnout. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Thank you.